Hello everybody, this is the second time I've made this video. The first time I thought I did such a good job, but it sounded like I was talking from across the room. This is about me telling you what my favorite books of 2024 are. I wrapped up December and January, but I haven't gotten to this point yet, and I want to do it now. I want to talk about the best reads that I had. I'm not gonna do a worst of 2024 because last year I found myself backpedaling a lot. So we're just going to focus on the positive. If I do a complete ranking, which I do want to do, then you'll know which books land in the bottom. But we're going to start with number 5 today. Number 5 on the list is Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. This is the story of Misha. He's a writer working in Hollywood. He is told by his producers that he needs to kill off his two beloved gay characters to follow the algorithm, to follow what's popular, what's going to grab ratings. That's all these bigwig producers care about. Misha refuses. He says no. When you go against power, good things don't typically happen. In this story, not only does he have to fight for what he believes in, these characters that he believes in, this representation, he also fights his past in a pretty unique and interesting way. Every time I thought that it was winding down, and keep in mind, I knew exactly where I was in the book. I knew the page numbers. I knew that I was in the middle and that the book was not ending, but there were these moments of calm where I let my guard down. I eventually gave up. I eventually gave up in believing that this book was going to wind down at all. But there were these moments, these really intimate moments, especially with Misha as a youngster, not seeing people like him represented in the media, and wanting to make a difference when he was older. And it was these scenes with him as a child, as a teenager, that made me feel for him. These were moments that I could relate to. As outrageous and over the top as the story was as a whole, I felt like I related to his childhood experience, not seeing people who lived like him, who thought like him, who loved like him. Definitely worth the read. It's funny at times, it's wild a lot of the time, but it's very intimate at times. Coming in at number 4 is Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash. This was a book that I came into with no expectations. I hadn't heard of this book, I hadn't heard of this author, but the Gullah Geechee culture is so important to South Carolina's history. If you don't know what Gullah Geechee is, it's a culture created by slaves to preserve the African heritage that white slave owners attempted to strip away from them. This is the story of Amelia Pezant, an anthropology student in New York, who, against her grandma's wishes, because her mother is also sick in this book, and that's another conflict that she has within herself, she travels to Dada Island, South Carolina, to visit family that she's never met before. When she gets there, she's a fish out of water. She's this student from the city of New York. She's a city girl. She goes to this island. They all kind of treat her like, you know, she doesn't belong here, because the culture's different. It is a culture shock. However, she sticks to her guns. She has a mission. She wants to get to know everybody. She wants to hear their stories. So she starts to interview them. And I believe she begins with her family first. Elizabeth and Iona are two other characters who I loved in this book. But Amelia is also somebody who's very easy to root for. This is treated as an anthology. Of course, Amelia is living in the present, so you do get her story throughout the book, but it's a collection of stories that are told by the people she meets. I really enjoyed reading this book through her perspective. Her internal conflict about her mother, about traveling to the island, about what she needs to do with the stories that she collects. All of this is so important to the plot and important to her. It's this internal conflict that makes her so human and so real and so easy to follow. If you are at all interested in learning about a culture and hearing them tell the lies, you'll find out what that means when you read, then I certainly recommend that you pick this book up. Number 3 on the list is Aloha Everything by Kaylin Malia George, illustrated by May Waite. I cannot emphasize enough how beautiful the illustrations of this book are. I have never read a picture book that I felt I could hang on the wall. I do not recommend ripping pages out of a book and framing them, but if May Waite were to sell some of these images, then, I could see somebody doing it. It really is beautiful. And Kayla Malia George, she did a great job writing this book too. It's the story of a girl named Ano who is essentially drinking in the world around her. This is Hawaii. She talks about the ocean, the water, the trees, the sky, the animals, everything. She soaks it in. She appreciates it. She learns about her culture as she is this young child. And this book provides educational value as well, in that at the end of it, there is a glossary of all of the Hawaiian words that you learn along the way. Excellent teaching tool for children and adults who want to pick this book up and learn about a language that is part of their nation. I think this book was funded by a Kickstarter campaign. I'm not sure, but I really hope that Kayla Malia George now has more wind at her back. The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Friends and family may be surprised that this is number 2 on my list, because I believe I read this in June, but the whole summer I did nothing but talk about this book and how much I learned through reading it. I didn't know about this moment in history outside of knowing that this book exists, because I've heard people review this before. So I at least knew to pick this up. But what this is about, it's a nonfiction. It's real. It really happened. It's the story of the women and girls, they were teenagers at the time, who were hired to work in this studio to paint watch dials for soldiers at war. Sounds innocent enough, but in order for the watches at the time to achieve that neon green glow that we associate so much with radioactivity, they used radium paint, which at the time was advertised as this thing, this agent, I guess, that could give you superpowers. The rich were mixing it in water. They were drinking it. They were thinking that it was the healthiest thing, and it would cure cancer if they ingested it. And it was just a mess. It was a load of misinformation. And these girls, these women, they were hired into the studio to paint these watch dials, to put these paintbrushes into their mouths to create these fine tips, because over time, paintbrushes fray. If you're a painter, you definitely understand. They would paint their teeth. They would wear fancy clothes to the studio so that the dust from the radium would cling to them, so that when they would go out at night, they would glow in the dark. All of this dangerous stuff was happening, and they had no idea. They were oblivious until things started going wrong, and the studio would not listen to them. This story is frustrating. It is angering. It follows a number of the women who were affected by this. So you really become attached to these women and their different stories. It really felt like body horror at times, if I'm being honest. But the amount of gaslighting and the decades that it took, it really is infuriating at times. But I could not reach a resolution here. And to know that this is part of American history is just wow. And this didn't really happen all that long ago. This was like the early 1900s. And like I said, it lasted for decades. So, it's kind of interesting to hear how far we've come from all of this misinformation to, I don't know, I guess misinformation about other important things. But I digress. We will move on to my number 1 book, which should be no surprise to anyone on BookTube, at least. This is James by Percival Everett. And no, I did not pick this as my number one because this is my name. I believe this was on, it was at least on a number of booktubers' best of 2024 lists. And it's not surprising to me either, because this was a phenomenal reimagining of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, written through the perspective of Jim. Rather than be sold again and taken from his family with absolutely zero shot at reconnecting with them at some point in the future, he decides to take matters into his own hands. He and Huckleberry Finn run away, which is one of the worst crimes you could commit at the time as a slave. This book was described as ferociously funny. However, while I understand that Jim had a wit, he was sarcastic at times. He was able to get his shots in, if you will. There were moments in this book where I questioned whether or not I should laugh at what was happening. An easy example, and I believe I mentioned this in my review as well, is his dialect. How he spoke to his family versus how he spoke to white people. Sometimes, speaking to white people, he would slip up. He would reveal that he was this well-read individual. He did love to read. He loved to write. And he would accidentally speak in that way. In those moments, I would laugh and I would have to catch myself because we were in his perspective, where any slip up, doesn't matter how small, it could spell death for him. So these moments where if any other character, if anybody else, if I were reading any other book, it would be funny. It would be humorous. I would chuckle a little bit and not have to catch myself. In this case, I did have to reconsider. I had to think, oh, wait, this could happen if he's found out. It was tense. It was anxiety inducing, where we meet so many people along the way, and oftentimes we don't know what their fate is in the story, but we're constantly thinking about them. Their presence is always there in our brain because we always want to know, are they okay? And that what if, knowing that they're always running and living on the edge. Percival Everett has a very poetic way of writing. I enjoyed being in Jim's perspective, but this book was heavy. As fast as I was able to read, at least the first part, this is broken into 3 parts, but I did have to pump the brakes a little bit. As quickly as I read this for a time, it was difficult. It wasn't an easy book to swallow. And the reason I pumped the brakes was because I felt that I was not soaking in what I needed to really get from this book by reading so fast. It's definitely something that you need to ponder. You need to kind of marinate a little bit, maybe pause after certain passages in this book to really understand what happens. I had to stop because there were some moments in this where I was just too shocked to keep going. And sometimes that happened in the dead middle of a chapter. I had to walk away and come back. But it's definitely worth the read. It was a new release. Everybody's talking about it. If you haven't picked this up and this does sound interesting to you, please read it. Do read it. If any of the other 4 books that I mentioned in this top 5 of 2024 interest you as well, their Goodreads links are all in the description below. Click on those, head on over to your local library or use your library app if they are available. If you enjoyed this video for whatever reason, do leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what your favorite books of 2024 were. Otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading.